Have you ever wondered what really goes on behind your neighbor's closed doors? Maybe it's the silence that unsettles you, or the way someone always seems to be watching when you're not supposed to notice. Tonight, you'll hear 9 terrifying stories of neighbors that prove the people living closest to us are often the ones we should fear the most. If you're brave enough, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more chilling stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Just don't be surprised if, by the end of these stories, you start looking at your own neighborhood a little differently.
The first story is from Emily, a 30-year-old marketing manager who thought moving from Boston to Portland would give her the fresh start she needed. She wanted slower mornings, ocean air, and neighbors who said hello without hurrying past. That was the dream, anyway. What she got instead was a neighborhood that felt too neat, too staged, like someone had drawn it from memory rather than reality. Her townhouse sat on a narrow street lined with identical gray facades and little square yards that always looked clipped within an inch of their lives. During the day, it was picturesque. At night, the silence seemed to grow legs. It didn't just sit outside, it crept under the door, into the walls, and pressed against her chest when she lay awake. Boston had been noisy, messy, alive. Sirens wailed, voices carried up from the street, music bled through walls that were too thin. Here, she could count how many neighbors turned their lights off by 10:15 p.m. She could tell which cars hadn't moved in days. That was why she noticed the black SUV so quickly. It started the third morning after her move. She left at 7:05 a.m., heading to her new office downtown, and there it was, idling at the curb directly across from her driveway. Tint windows dark, exhaust puffing white in the cold. The engine ran, but no one got out. Emily didn't think much of it. People warmed up their cars, she told herself. Maybe they were waiting for someone. But the SUV was there again the next morning. Same place, same time. By the end of the week, it became routine. 7:05, she left for work, and the SUV eased into motion a few moments later, always a few cars back, never passing, never falling away. It didn't tailgate, didn't weave, didn't draw attention. It just existed in her mirrors like a shadow. She joked about it once over drinks with a coworker. "Guess I've got a secret admirer who likes my commute." He laughed, told her she was probably imagining it. "Maybe you just leave at the same time every day. It's Portland. People stick to schedules here." She tried to laugh along, but something about the stillness of that SUV, the way it never varied, bothered her. At stoplights, she glanced at the windshield, but the tint swallowed everything inside. One night in early November, she stayed late at the office. When she finally pulled into her driveway, nearly 10 p.m., most of the neighborhood was dark. Porch lights glowed faintly like watchful eyes. And there it was, the SUV, parked across the street, engine off this time. A figure sat inside, barely visible under the street lamp, not scrolling on a phone, not fiddling with controls, just facing her house. Emily told herself to act normal. She stepped out, locked her car with shaking hands, and tried to move quickly but calmly up the steps. As she reached the door, she heard the faint whir of a window sliding down. "You always get home around this time," a man's voice said. Calm, conversational, almost kind.
Her stomach dropped. "Yeah, long day," she muttered, her voice brittle. She shut the door faster than she meant to, twisting the deadbolt twice for reassurance. On the other side of that door, she pressed her back against the wood, heart pounding, listening to the quiet. That night, she didn't sleep. Every time headlights passed outside, her chest seized. The next morning, she tried to outsmart him. She left early, 6:20. The SUV was already there. The following day, she left late, close to 8. He waited until she pulled out, then followed. She tried weaving through back streets, cutting through neighborhoods, doubling back. No matter what route she took, he always managed to reappear, a few cars back, steady, and deliberate. Soon, her life unraveled into strategy. She unplugged her TV so its glow wouldn't betray her at night. She parked a block over to break his line of sight. She stopped going for runs after work. The grocery store became a sprint, her eyes darting to every reflection of black paint in the glass doors. Finally, she called her brother in Boston. "I think someone's following me," she said, her voice shaking. His reply was immediate, urgent. "Emily, go to the police. Don't wait." She promised him she would, and she did. The officer took notes, but couldn't do much. No plates, no crime. They told her to keep an eye out, as if she wasn't already living every second in sharp, obsessive awareness. What broke her was the note. It was tucked under her doormat one evening when she came home. At first, she thought it was a delivery slip. She unfolded it in the porch light, and her throat tightened. "You drive too fast through the neighborhood. One of these mornings you might not make it." The handwriting was neat, polite. The words weren't shouted in anger. They were written like an observation. That calmness chilled her more than anything else. She bought cameras the next day, 2 for outside, 1 from her living room window aimed across the street. Installing them made her feel both safer and exposed, like she was admitting his power over her. For 3 nights, the cameras caught nothing unusual: passing cars, a neighbor's cat. Then came the motion alert at 2:17 a.m. Emily's hand shook as she opened the live feed on her phone. The man had stepped out of the SUV. He walked slowly up her driveway, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't try the knob, didn't knock. He simply stood at her front door for nearly 4 minutes, unmoving, staring. Then, as casually as if he'd just checked the time, he turned, walked back to his SUV, and sat inside for another half hour before driving away. She showed the footage to the police the next morning. Their faces shifted. This time, they believed her. They dug deeper, and what they found made her skin crawl. The man had a history, previous harassment complaints, a restraining order in another state, neighbors who'd filed reports about his watching habits. None of it had stuck. No prison time, no permanent record strong enough to keep him away. But the pattern was undeniable. The SUV was impounded. A restraining order was filed on Emily's behalf. Within weeks, his townhouse 2 streets over was empty. Curtains drawn, mailbox stuffed, gone. But peace didn't return with his absence. She checked the cameras every night. She memorized the hum of every car that passed, and every black SUV still made her grip the wheel too tight. The silence of Portland didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt like waiting. One night her sister called. "Do you feel safer now?" she asked softly. Emily stared at her blank TV, reflection ghosted in the glass. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she whispered the truth. "He's gone, but I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. Because the scariest part wasn't that he followed me, it was how normal it seemed at first, how easy it was to dismiss, how much of myself I gave away by doubting my instincts." Years later, Emily has moved again. Higher fences, brighter lights, cameras cover every angle, routes changed weekly. Some people would call it paranoia. She calls it survival. And still, sometimes when the night feels too quiet and headlights linger too long in her mirror, she remembers the black SUV idling across the street. And she wonders if people like him ever really leave, or if they just wait for the silence to settle before returning.
The second story is from Claire Mitchell, 34 years old, a woman who thought a move to Seattle would give her back the pieces of herself she'd lost. After years of burnout and a breakup that left her hollow, she wanted anonymity. She wanted glass towers, coded elevators, keycard lobbies, a fortress of the sky where no one could touch her. Her apartment was on the 12th floor of a sleek new high-rise, all steel and glass, polished marble in the lobby, cameras in every hallway. The kind of place that marketed safety like an amenity. Live above it all, the brochure said. Clara thought she had bought peace. But peace in a city that quiet is fragile. Silence there doesn't feel like rest. It feels like surveillance. She worked remote, long days as a UX designer, often pushing through until midnight, surrounded by the glow of multiple screens. To fill the quiet, she kept music playing low, jazz usually. But even with sound in the air, the walls felt close, the halls sterile, the elevators dinged too politely, the neighbors smiled too briefly. Then one evening, in the spring of 2021, she stepped into the elevator with her arms full of groceries and noticed him. Tall, slender, graying hair slicked back, round glasses that reflected the overhead lights so she couldn't quite see his eyes. His posture was stiff but deliberate, and something about the way he looked at her made her skin prickle. Not because he resembled her ex, worse. He looked exactly like her high school math tutor, Mr. Devlin, the one who had hovered behind her chair too often, whose encouragement had always carried a tone she hadn't understood at 15, but recognized as wrong at 34. Her breath caught in her chest. The resemblance was uncanny enough that her body recoiled before her mind could reason it out. The man glanced at the sketch pad tucked under her arm, the one she carried everywhere. "You're an artist," he said, voice measured, almost kind. Claire forced a shrug. "Just a hobby." But his lips curved faintly. "No, you create. I can see it." She told herself it was coincidence, that her nerves were overreacting. Just elevator small talk, that was all. But when she returned from taking the trash out that night, there was something under her door. A folded sheet of paper. A drawing. Her face, rendered in clean, sharp graphite lines. Too precise to be casual. He had studied her, the slope of her nose, the set of her jaw. Beneath it, a note in thin, deliberate script. "Inspiration lives next door." She dropped it like it burned. Over the next week, more gifts appeared. A charcoal portrait left outside her door, a wire sculpture on her balcony railing, something only reachable from his unit. Each one was her, but distorted. Her mouth stretched too wide, her eyes too large, almost devouring, her hair spilling out into shadowy tangles. Claire asked her neighbor, Mrs. Lee, a warm older woman who always lingered in the lobby to chat, if she knew anything. "Oh, that's Walter," she said gently, like explaining away a child's mischief. "He's eccentric, but harmless. He asked about you, said you liked art. I told him you'd appreciate his effort. He's just lonely, dear. Invisible, maybe? You know how it is?" Invisible. The word gnawed at Claire. Invisible didn't excuse intrusion. Invisible didn't excuse obsession. The gifts didn't stop. They escalated. One morning, she opened her door to find a stack of papers taped across it. Not sketches this time, assessments. Routine, B+. Work ethic, A. Emotional resilience, D. He was grading her, observing her every move.
Shaking, she brought them to the concierge. "Look at this. Check the cameras. He's stalking me." The concierge frowned, barely glancing at the pages. "He lives here too, Miss Mitchell. Unless he's threatening you, there's not much we can do." That night, the footsteps began. Not passing footsteps, lingering, pacing. The floor outside her apartment creaked under deliberate weight. Then came the knock, soft, and his voice. "Claire, I can see it. The masterpiece. You're close. Let me in."
She pressed her back against the door, every muscle rigid, listening until the sound faded. Her apartment stopped feeling like a home. It became a gallery of paranoia. She taped her own drawings over the windows, desperate to reclaim space. She ate little, she slept less. Every shadow felt studied. Then came the canvas. Propped against her door one morning, a painting of her apartment. Her desk, her balcony, the curve of her lamp. Details he could only know from watching, from inside. Claire's voice shook when she called the police. They came, they nodded. They used words like disturbing, obsession, but the answer was the same. Until he harms you, we can only advise caution. Document everything. Caution felt useless when your life was already an exhibit. So she turned to the only language he seemed to understand: art. For 3 sleepless nights, she worked, painting until her knuckles ached. The result was not beauty, but reflection. A warped mirror of paint and resin, distorted so that anyone who looked into it saw themselves stretched, twisted. She buried his likeness in the distortion, a face emerging from the warped reflection, watching back. One evening she left it outside his door. A note attached: "You wanted a masterpiece? Here it is." That night, the pounding shook her walls. His voice, ragged, breaking through the wood. "You don't understand. This isn't yours to change. You're ruining it." Claire sat in the dark, pepper spray in her trembling hand, waiting for the footsteps to retreat. The next morning, Mrs. Lee knocked softly. Her expression was weary, disappointed. "Claire, he said you mocked him. He only ever admired you. Why would you provoke him?" Claire wanted to scream, to shake her, to make her see that admiration twisted into possession isn't harmless, it's hunger. Weeks later, Walter was arrested after another tenant filed a harassment report. His apartment was a shrine: sketches of residents, sculptures, paintings, lives stolen and displayed. He was released under restrictions. The building called it resolved. But Claire never believed in safety again. Even in her new apartment, with brighter lights, thicker locks, and cameras on every corner, she still feels it. In reflections that linger too long, in footsteps outside her door at night, in the silence that sometimes hums like it's holding its breath. Because here's the truth she learned. Obsession isn't loud. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, politely, patiently, until you doubt your own instincts. And when someone decides your life is their canvas, you stop being a person. You become a study, a possession, a masterpiece they believe they're entitled to finish. Even now, when Claire passes a blank wall or a darkened window, she swears she sees the faintest outline of herself staring back, drawn by a hand that never really let go. And the scariest thought, maybe somewhere, in another sterile apartment, he's still painting her.
This account comes from Daniel Harris, who grew up in a town called Willow Creek, a place so small it barely appeared on maps. By the time he was 12,
He'd already lived in 4 different houses, but he swears the one on the corner of Birch Lane is the only place that ever felt aware of him. Daniel's father had just taken a job managing a lumber mill on the edge of town, and his mother was desperate for a slower life. She told anyone who would listen that she was done with the chaos of the city. Willow Creek looked like the answer. An old main street with a diner, a single stoplight, and houses tucked into tree-lined streets where kids rode their bikes until dusk. The Harris house was bigger than anything they'd had before. Pale yellow siding, a sagging porch, windows that stared blankly out across a yard pressed close by thick woods. Daniel remembers the smell when they first walked inside. Not mildew exactly, but something sour, like the walls had absorbed too much time. His parents brushed it off. "It just needs to be lived in," his dad said, patting the banister. At first, life seemed good. Daniel shared a room with his younger brother, Alex. Their window overlooked the backyard and the looming tree line. Daniel got the bed closest to the glass. At night, he loved watching the stars, something he'd never seen back in the city glow. For a few weeks, he thought the move had been a gift, until the tapping started. It was late September, around 9:30 one night. Daniel was awake with a flashlight, sketching superheroes in a notebook, when he heard it. A faint tap, tap, tap against the window. Slow, deliberate, not random like rain. He froze, pen hovering in midair. "Alex, did you hear that?" he whispered. His brother mumbled something in his sleep. The sound stopped. Daniel convinced himself it was a moth, maybe a branch brushing in the wind, but the next night it came again. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more, and then again the night after that. Sometimes Alex stirred annoyed, but he never seemed afraid. Daniel was. One evening, when the family cat, Willow, suddenly arched her back at the window and bolted from the room, Daniel felt his first deep, gnawing fear. Cats don't spook at nothing. Weeks passed. The taps turned to scrapes, long, slow drags across the glass, like nails drawing invisible lines. Daniel tried yanking the blinds open mid-scrape once, heart hammering, but there was nothing. Just the yard bathed in moonlight and the wall of trees standing too far to reach the house. When he told his parents, they smiled the way adults do when they don't want to admit they're unsettled. His mother muttered, "Old houses make noise." His father said it was probably branches, but Daniel noticed the way his dad's jaw clenched. He didn't believe it either. Then the knocking spread. When Daniel slept on the living room couch, there were soft knocks on the sliding glass door. When he tried hiding in the guest room, there were scratches at that window too. Even once, locked in the bathroom with the light on, there was a sharp rap on the door itself. It followed him. By winter, Daniel had adapted in the way only kids can. As long as Willow curled up at the foot of his bed, he managed to sleep. But 2 years later, when Alex got his own room and Willow decided she preferred the stairs, Daniel was alone again. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped.
At 13, Daniel slept through the night for the first time in years. The silence felt like a blessing. He convinced himself it had been imagination, a trick of childhood nerves, until he met the man in the woods. It was early October. The air had that sharp bite of changing leaves. Daniel and Alex were kicking a ball around in the backyard when it rolled too far into the trees. They chased it, laughing until the forest grew unnervingly quiet. Daniel always remembered that, the way the birds seemed to vanish, the leaves stilling like they were holding their breath. The ball had rolled into the yard of a house Daniel swore he'd never seen before. Small, weathered, its windows dark. A man stood there already, holding the ball in his hand.
He was tall, thin, his brown hair unkempt, wearing a faded flannel shirt. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You boys lose this?" he called. Alex, ever trusting, ran forward. "Yeah, thanks!" Daniel hung back. Something about the man felt crooked, like a picture tilted just enough to bother you. "You live up on Birch Lane, don't you?" the man asked. Alex, ever trusting, nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I'm 9, he's 12. Daniel's stomach dropped. He wanted to shout at his brother to stop talking, but the words stuck. The man, who introduced himself as Martin, handed back the ball. As they turned to go, he added, almost casually, "I see you two out here a lot. Sometimes I watch from my window." He chuckled. Alex laughed nervously. Daniel did not. They didn't tell their parents. Maybe Daniel was afraid they wouldn't believe him. Maybe some part of him already knew that telling them wouldn't change anything. A week later, the tapping returned. Only now, it was louder, sharper, more insistent. It had been gone a year, but it came back with a kind of glee, like it had been waiting. One night, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his hoodie and slipped into the yard. The air was cold enough to sting, his breath puffing white. He'd barely made it past the porch when a hand clamped over his mouth and yanked him back into the trees. The hand smelled of earth and sweat. Daniel thrashed, bit, kicked. The man cursed, dropping him. In the sliver of moonlight that cut through the branches, Daniel saw his face. Martin, the man from the woods. "You little brat," he hissed, lunging again. Daniel bolted, screaming. The porch light snapped on. His father burst out, shouting, and in that instant, Martin vanished into the dark. The police came, they searched, they nodded, but nothing ever came of it. Martin was never found. The house where Daniel had seen him seemed to disappear too. The next time he went into the woods, there was only clearing where he swore a house had stood. Years later, Daniel still lives in Willow Creek. He's grown now with kids of his own, but some nights, when the house is quiet and the forest presses close, he hears it again, the faint tap, tap, tap at the window. And in the silence that follows, he wonders if Martin had been watching because he wanted to, or because the house itself had taught him to. And that's the part Daniel can never shake. Maybe the thing that noticed him when he was 12 never really stopped. It's just waiting for him, and now for his children too.
This account comes from Sarah Miller, who in 2009 thought she had finally found the perfect place to raise our family. After years of apartment living in Dallas, she and her husband Mark moved their 2 children, Daniel, 10, and Sophie, 7, into a quiet little neighborhood on the outskirts of Tulsa. It was everything she thought she wanted. The house was modest, single-story with faded blue shutters, but it had a fenced yard for the kids and a cul-de-sac where they could ride their bikes without her worrying about traffic. Neighbors waved when they passed. At night, the loudest sound was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional dog barking a few streets over. For a few months, it felt like peace. But Sarah would later tell me that peace is deceptive. It dulls your instincts, makes you second-guess yourself when something feels wrong. The first sign came late that summer. A moving truck appeared in front of the last house on the cul-de-sac, a sagging property that had been vacant for years. Sarah remembers watching from her kitchen window as 2 men unloaded furniture. One was tall, broad-shouldered, always in a dark jacket no matter how hot the day was. The other was thinner, quicker, carrying boxes without meeting anyone's eyes. Behind the truck sat an old maroon van, its side door open. Inside, a woman sat slumped against the seat, her hair falling in tangled waves over her face. She never got out, never looked up. She just sat there, hour after hour, as if the moving world around her didn't exist. "New neighbors?" Mark asked that evening as he set down his briefcase. "Looks like it," Sarah said. though the words didn't feel right in her mouth. She couldn't explain why, but something about them unsettled her. The way the tall one stared too long at nothing in particular. The way the blinds in the house went down the very day they moved in and never came back up. The family learned the tall man's name was Carl from an overheard exchange with another neighbor. The thinner one was his brother, Dean. The woman remained nameless, faceless behind the van's shadow. At first, Sarah brushed it off. People were private. Maybe they just wanted to be left alone. But small things began to pile up. Daniel came home from the bus stop one afternoon and mentioned that Carl had been standing nearby, not saying anything, just standing. Sophie abandoned her bike in the driveway one evening, running inside with wide eyes. "The man was by the mailbox," she whispered. "He was watching me." Sarah wanted to dismiss it as childish exaggeration, but then she began noticing it too. When she took the trash out at dusk, Carl was sometimes leaning against his van, a cigarette glowing faintly in the shadows. Not smoking casually, smoking while staring at their house. When she met his gaze, he looked away too quickly, too deliberately. One Saturday, she tried to convince herself she was being paranoid. She baked muffins and walked with Sophie to their door. When Dean answered, he looked startled, almost nervous. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Sarah said, forcing a smile as she held out the plate. He took it without opening the door more than a crack. "Thanks," he muttered. "Is Carl around?" Dean's eyes flicked up the stairs behind him. "He's busy." Then he closed the door. That was it. No introductions, no polite conversation, just the door shutting between them. The feeling didn't go away. It grew, like mold under wallpaper. Then in late October came the breaking point. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon, the kind where the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Sarah was folding laundry when someone pounded on the front door. When she opened it, she found her neighbor, Mrs. Walker, pale and out of breath. "Sarah, you need to come," she gasped. "It's Daniel." Sarah dropped the laundry and ran barefoot into the street. Halfway down the block, she saw him, her son pressed against the fence, his backpack sliding off one shoulder. Carl stood beside the maroon van, passenger door open. His hand was on Daniel's arm.
"Daniel!" Sarah's scream ripped from her throat. Carl turned his head, and Sarah swore his eyes were the coldest she had ever seen. Empty, but worse than empty, like staring into something that wasn't quite human. Mark came running from the house, shouting, "Let go of him!" For a moment, Carl didn't move. He just stared, expressionless. Then he shoved Daniel back against the fence, slid into the van, and pulled the door shut. Mr. Hayes, another neighbor, tried to block the street, arms outstretched. Carl only smiled, just the faintest curl of his lips, before swerving around him and driving off, tires shrieking against the pavement. Sarah gathered Daniel into her arms, trembling so hard she could barely hold him. His voice was muffled against her shoulder. "He said he lost his dog. He wanted me to help find it. But there wasn't a leash, no collar, no dog." The police came. They took notes. They nodded. But when Sarah pressed them, their answers were hollow. "Sounds like maybe he was just trying to talk to your kid," one officer said, without meeting his eyes. "He had the van door open. He had his hand on my son," Sarah snapped. "We'll file a report," the officer replied. By the next morning, the house at the end of the street was empty. The blinds were gone, the van was gone, the men were gone. Even the muffin plate Sarah had given Dean had disappeared, as if they had never been there at all. For months afterward, Sarah lived in vigilance. Locks, motion lights, fences. But what haunted her wasn't just the near loss of her son. It was the look in Carl's eyes, that hollow stillness, that wrongness. Years have passed since then. Daniel is grown now, with kids of his own. Sarah tells herself it's over, that it was just a chapter in the past. But some nights, when the wind carries the faint scent of cigarette smoke through her window, she still wakes up gasping. Some nights she swears she sees a shadow pause at the corner of the street, patient, waiting. And she can't shake the thought that the house at the end of the block wasn't abandoned, it was watching. And every time she sees a moving truck, she wonders, are they moving in? Or have they always been there, waiting for someone new to notice?
This account comes from Sarah Miller, who in the spring of 2022 thought she had finally found a place where she could start over. After a messy breakup and the kind of burnout that makes every day feel like you're dragging your bones through wet sand, she left her life in San Diego behind for Santa Fe. She wanted quiet. She wanted clean air. She wanted to believe she could piece herself back together in a new space. The apartment she found was small but charming, or at least that's what she told herself the first time she stepped inside. It was tucked into the top floor of a converted adobe building just off Canyon Road. Pale stucco walls, narrow staircases, and creaky wooden beams overhead. Tourists wandered below during the day, but at night, the whole neighborhood folded into silence so complete she could hear the scrape of her own breath. Sarah remembers standing in the empty living room, sunlight spilling orange across the uneven floorboards, and feeling it. Not comfort, not excitement, but something else, something watching. The air seemed thick, the kind of silence that pressed against her eardrums, waiting for her to speak first. She signed the lease anyway. At 29, she was tired of running. The apartment was supposed to be proof that she could build a life alone. The realtor brushed off her hesitation, rattling the keys in her hand like Sarah was wasting her time. "This is a good deal," she said. "You won't find better in this part of town." That night, Sarah lay on the floor among cardboard boxes, listening to the walls breathe. The pipes rattled and hissed, but it wasn't just noise. It was a rhythm. Tick, 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 like fingernails tapping wood. She told herself it was just an old building stretching in the cool desert air. Still, she didn't sleep. The days fell into routine. She taught online art classes in the mornings, unpacked in the afternoons, and tried to paint again in the evenings. For a while, she convinced herself it was only loneliness making the apartment feel strange, until she met her neighbor. He appeared one afternoon as she struggled with a box of canvases on the stairs. Mid-40s, tall, thinning blonde hair combed neatly back, his shirt pressed too carefully. His name was Peter, and his smile was the kind that felt rehearsed, wide, polite, but stretched too far. His eyes lingered just a second longer than they should have. "You're the artist," he said. "I've seen your easel in the window. It's nice to have someone expressive nearby." Sarah forced a smile, muttered a thank you, and slipped into her apartment faster than was polite. She told herself she was overreacting, that she was still too raw, still seeing ghosts in every shadow. But small things began to shift. A brush she left out was tucked neatly into a drawer. Her coffee mug, left half full on the counter, would be rinsed and placed in the dish rack. And then one night, while vacuuming under the couch, she found a necklace she hadn't seen in years, one she'd lost long before the move. It sat in her palm, glittering like it had been placed there intentionally. She started locking the windows, double-checking the deadbolt, but the movements in her apartment grew bolder. A canvas leaned against the wrong wall. Her shoes rearranged in pairs by the door. The air seemed to hum with anticipation when she returned each night, as though the place had been waiting for her. And then the notes began. The first appeared under her door. "Blue suits your eyes." The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind that took time. Sarah froze. She hadn't worn anything blue since she'd moved in. The second note came 3 days later. "Your plants looked thirsty, so I helped."
Her balcony was 3 stories high, no shared ledges, no way for anyone to reach it without being inside. Sarah's stomach turned cold. She ran into Peter again in the hallway. He was carrying a cardboard box, smiling like they were old friends. "You've made that place your own," he said. "It's like a gallery in there. I noticed the details." Something in his voice made her skin crawl. She fumbled with her keys, muttered thanks, and shut the door with shaking hands. That night, she ordered a hidden camera, small enough to sit unnoticed on the bookshelf, streaming to her phone. She told herself it was paranoia, that she'd catch nothing and finally be able to breathe. She was wrong. 2 nights later, at 3:07 a.m., the footage caught her front door opening slowly, carefully, and then Peter stepped inside, barefoot, moving with calm familiarity. He didn't steal. He didn't search. He wandered. His fingers brushed the rim of her mug, trailed across the easel, paused on the edge of a half-finished painting. He tilted his head like a curator admiring a piece in a museum. Then he stopped at her bedroom door. He didn't touch it. He just stood there, listening to her breathe. After a minute, he turned, set a small jar on her desk, and left as silently as he had entered. When Sarah woke, the jar was there. Inside, wrapped in red thread, was a bundle of her hair. Her hands shook so violently she dropped her phone twice before she could call the police. They came, watched the footage, their expressions darkening. They knocked on Peter's door. Sarah heard his voice muffled through the wall, denying, insisting she had staged it. But the jar, he couldn't explain the jar. They took him in, released him the same night. The building manager pulled Sarah aside. "He's been a problem before," he whispered. "Other tenants complained. He's been evicted twice, but no one pressed charges." Sarah changed the locks, bought more cameras, slept with the lights on. But the fear didn't leave when Peter did, because in his absence, the apartment seemed to change. The silence grew thicker, pressing against her skin. Sometimes the warped floorboards seemed to ripple in her peripheral vision, as if something moved just beneath the surface. Late at night, beneath the hum of the air conditioner, she heard whispers threaded so faintly she almost convinced herself they weren't there. "Stay." The word came clearer each night. Once, half asleep, Sarah whispered back, "What do you want?" The radiator hissed in reply. From then on, the disturbances grew. Her paintings tilted on the wall, her chair angled slightly toward the window each morning. Her keys moved from counter to table, small things, just enough to tell her she wasn't the only one arranging her life. The final night when she came home from work, a jar sat in the middle of the floor. Inside was a scrap of canvas, one of her old paintings, a faceless figure standing in a doorway, the brushstrokes hers. Her knees buckled. She knew she had thrown that painting away before the move. That night, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were clear, male, female, layered together like a chorus. "Stay, stay, stay." The lights flickered violently. The walls groaned, bending inward. Sarah grabbed her suitcase, packed in a frenzy, heart hammering. As she halted toward the door, the balcony slammed shut behind her with a crack that rattled the glass. "Stay!" Her scream cut through the silence as she wrenched the door open, and for a split second, in the flickering hallway light, she swore she saw Peter standing at the end of the hall, his eyes blank, his mouth stretched too wide, silent, laughing. She never stopped running until she was across town. Sarah never went back. She left the rest of her things to rot inside that apartment. She lives in a modern condo now, bright, new, full of noise. Her neighbors nod politely. The silence here is normal. At least, it should be. Because sometimes, in the small hours of the night, Sarah swears she hears it again. That faint tick, tick, tick at the walls. And she wonders if Peter ever really left, or if the apartment itself had simply found a new way to follow her.
This account comes from Rachel Dawson, who was 32 when she moved into the apartment complex that still lingers in her nightmares. It was early spring in Portland, damp enough that the air always seemed to cling to your skin. Rachel had just separated from her husband and moved with her daughter, Lily, who was 7 and full of questions about everything, and her son, Max, only 4, who still believed monsters could live in closets. They ended up in a squat, aging brick complex just outside the city, 4 floors high, with buzzing fluorescents in the stairwells and a parking lot that never quite emptied of shadows. Rachel told herself it was temporary, 6 months, maybe a year, just long enough to save money and figure out what came next. But from the first night, she knew the building wasn't right. Not wrong, like peeling wallpaper or leaking faucets. No, it was subtler, quieter, a pressure in the silence, as though the building noticed her. That first night, after the kids were asleep, Lily curled with her stuffed fox, Max insisting she check under his bed twice, Rachel collapsed onto the couch with a blanket and her laptop. She half-watched a cooking show, the kind with cheerful voices that fill empty rooms. Then, just after midnight, the buzzer went off. It wasn't the friendly chime of a doorbell. It was sharp, metallic, insistent. The kind of sound you felt in your bones, vibrating straight through the stillness of the night. Rachel froze. The complex didn't have an intercom or cameras, just a buzzer to unlock the front door. Usually neighbors buzzed themselves in, or someone leaned out a window to let a delivery driver through. But this was different. One buzz, that was it. No second try, no knock at her door. Just silence. She told herself it was a mistake. Someone pressed the wrong number. She turned the volume up on her laptop and tried to forget it. The next night, it happened again at 12:47 a.m. One sharp buzz, then nothing. Rachel's stomach dropped. She sat rigid on the couch, staring at her door, listening to the silence press in. The kids stirred once in their sleep, as if they'd felt it too. The third night, she asked her downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, if she'd heard it. Mrs. Thompson was in her 70s, always in pressed cardigans, always smelling faintly of lavender. Rachel kept her tone casual. "Did your buzzer go off the last couple nights?" Mrs. Thompson gave her a sharp look. "No, didn't hear a thing. Why, did yours?" Rachel nodded. Mrs. Thompson smiled then, not warmly, the kind of smile that said she knew more than she was willing to share. "Best not to answer those. You never know who's out there." That was when Rachel's unease solidified into fear. If someone were pressing random buzzers, wouldn't Mrs. Thompson's have gone off too? Why only hers? That night, Max crawled into Lily's bed without asking. Rachel found them curled together in the morning, Max muttering about the bad man outside. When she pressed, he buried his face in his sister's blanket. By the fourth night, Rachel was wide awake when it came. 12:59 a.m. The buzzer cut through the silence like a blade. Her skin prickled. This time, she crept to the blinds and parted them just enough to look down at the street. A figure stood under the flickering streetlight across the road, still, hood pulled low, body unmoving. Rachel couldn't see a face, but she didn't need to. She knew, in that way your body knows danger before your mind does, that they were watching her building.
She barely slept. The next day, she called the property manager, a man named Brian who always smelled like too much cologne. She explained, careful, measured, about the buzzers, about the figure. "It's probably just some kid messing around, or a homeless guy. Happens around here, don't worry." "Brian, it's the same time every night, and someone was standing outside." He sighed, annoyed. "Unless there's damage, I can't do much. Keep your door locked, it's probably nothing." That word echoed through her head, nothing. But her body knew better. By the 5th night, she pulled both kids into her bed, shoved chairs against the door, and sat in the dark with her phone in one hand, flashlight in the other. Every sound of the apartment felt magnified. The hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of air through the vents. At exactly 1 a.m., the buzzer went off. But this time, it didn't stop there. She heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, dragging. Rachel's whole body locked. The kids shifted in their sleep, unaware. She crept toward the door, pressing her eye to the peephole. A figure stood directly outside, hood pulled low, gloved hands at their sides. Not knocking, not moving, just waiting. Her hand shook so badly she almost dropped the phone as she dialed 911. "There's someone outside my apartment," she whispered. "He's right outside my door. My kids are here. Please send someone." The dispatcher's voice stayed calm, steady. Officers were nearby. "Stay quiet, stay on the line." Rachel crouched on the floor beside the bed, phone pressed to her ear, heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it through the door. The figure shifted once, knocked gently, not on her door, but on her neighbor's. Then silence. Minutes crawled by until a loud bang echoed from downstairs. The police. When officers reached her floor, the hallway was empty. But they found something worse. Scratches on Max's bedroom window. The paint chipped, faint smudges on the glass, fingerprints, small ones, right next to where her son's head would have been if he'd slept there. Rachel's legs buckled when she saw. She had brought both kids into her room that night by instinct. Later, police swept the basement storage area. In the corner of the room that was supposed to stay locked, they found a sleeping bag, a backpack, snack wrappers, and a notebook. Inside, apartment numbers, scribbled notes about who answered buzzers, who didn't, and her name, written 3 times. They told her they'd increased patrols, that she and the kids were safe now, but Rachel knew better. Because the real horror wasn't the man they eventually arrested weeks later, wandering the neighborhood with a duffel bag of tools. The real horror was the building itself. Because even after he was gone, the buzzer didn't stop. Not every night, not always at the same time, but enough. One sharp buzz cutting through silence, like the building was reminding her it hadn't finished. Even now, years later, in a different city, in a newer apartment, Rachel sometimes hears it. Just as she's drifting toward sleep, the phantom metallic buzz echoing in her bones. And sometimes, when she wakes in the dark, she swears she sees faint fingerprints on the glass, tiny ones, already fading as the sun comes up. And she wonders if the buzzing was ever really calling him, or if it had always been calling her.
This account comes from Daniel Harker, a man who swears the quietest year of his life nearly killed him. He told me his story over black coffee in a downtown diner, his hands wrapped too tight around the mug, as if even retelling it could let something slip back in through the cracks. After his divorce in 2019, Daniel needed space. His words, not mine. He'd spent 16 years in a marriage that ended with slammed doors, screaming matches muffled behind drywall, and neighbors who politely pretended not to hear. When it was over, He packed what little he had left into the back of a borrowed truck and told himself silence would heal him. He found it, or thought he did, in a squat little duplex on the far end of Tallahassee. Cheap rent, a patch of lawn, and just enough space to breathe. His unit was on the left. The one on the right belonged to an old man named Morris. 70s, maybe older, Daniel guessed. Thin, wiry, his cap always pulled low enough that you couldn't quite read his face. Their relationship was the kind Daniel wanted. Distant, polite. They exchanged nods, muttered greetings, and then returned to their separate lives. No casseroles, no unwanted invitations, no one asking questions about why a man in his 40s suddenly lived alone. The duplex had a detached garage, a squat structure behind both units. Peeling white paint, warped siding, doors that screamed every time they moved. Daniel didn't use it for much. A few boxes from the marriage he wasn't ready to open, a toolbox, some old winter clothes, a bicycle with flat tires. He locked it religiously. A man alone learns to check things twice. The first sign something was wrong was subtle. One night in October, Daniel came home from a late shift. He stepped out of his car, balancing a bag of takeout, and froze. The garage light was on. He never left that light on, ever. The hair on his arms prickled. He set the food down and crept closer. The lock on the door was intact. No windows broken, nothing obviously out of place. He stepped inside, heart thudding. The air felt used, like someone had just left. But the boxes were stacked. The tools were in their drawers. Everything looked untouched. He told himself he was imagining it. Shut the light off, locked the door, went inside. The next morning, he needed a wrench. He unlocked the garage and swung the door open, toast still in his mouth, and stopped cold. 2 drawers on the tool chest were hanging wide open. A box of screws had spilled across the floor, and his box cutter, one of the only tools he kept sharp and ready, was gone. Daniel stared. He was meticulous with tools. He had inherited that habit from his father, who used to say, "A man who loses track of his tools loses track of himself." The lock was fine, the windows unbroken. He told himself he must have been careless. Divorce had left him rattled, distracted. But deep down, he knew. Someone had been in there. That night, he bought a cheap motion sensor camera, hooked it to his phone, and pointed it at the garage, just in case. The first 3 nights gave him nothing but raccoons, squirrels, and once a stray cat slipping through the fence. He laughed it off, almost relieved. The 4th night, his phone buzzed at 3:12 a.m. Groggy, he tapped it open, expecting another raccoon. Instead, his blood went cold. A figure slipped across the frame. A man. He crouched low, moving with deliberate care, as if he knew exactly where the camera's blind spots were. He paused at the sagging back panel, worked it loose with patient hands, and slid inside. Daniel watched the clip over and over, trying to turn it into something else. Maybe the shadows tricked him. Maybe it wasn't his neighbor, but someone who looked like him. But no, it was Morris. And Morris didn't steal anything. He stayed inside 5 minutes. Then he slipped back out through the fence, vanishing into the night.
The next morning, daylight showed fresh pry marks on the siding. Nails bent, wood splintered. Daniel printed a screenshot from the video and hid it in his desk drawer, just in case. Inside the garage, he taped a note to the tool chest. "I know someone's been in here. You're on camera." For a few nights, nothing happened. The silence returned. Daniel let himself breathe. But dread never leaves. It waits. The following Monday, he came home at 6 with groceries in his arms. As he rounded the corner into the backyard, the sight stopped him cold. The garage door was wide open. Not unlocked, not ajar, wide open. Daniel dropped the bags where he stood and ran. The garage was wrecked. Shelves overturned, boxes split open, tools scattered across the floor like bones. But nothing was missing. It didn't feel like theft. It felt like searching. In the back corner, near the Pride siding, he found a neat circle of cigarette butts on the concrete floor, a blackened stain where someone had sat, smoking, waiting. That broke him. He called the police. To his surprise, they didn't dismiss him. He showed them the footage, the cigarette pile, the bent siding. One officer asked if he'd had conflicts with Morris. Daniel shook his head, barely spoke to the man. Another officer looked at him carefully and said, "Would you let us set up surveillance?" Daniel didn't hesitate. That night, he packed a bag and stayed with a friend across town. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured himself walking into that garage and finding Morris already there, crouched in the dark. 2 nights later, at 2:40 a.m., the camera buzzed. Daniel tapped the feed. His stomach turned to ice. Morris crept into view again. Same approach, same cap, same careful movements. He crouched near the panel, lingering this time, just staring at the garage, rocking slightly like he was rehearsing something in his head. Then he adjusted the panel, slipped inside. Shadows moved fast. The officers closed in silently. They grabbed him as he tried to crawl back out through the fence. On him, they found a hunting knife, a bundle of zip ties, and black gloves. Hidden in the weeds nearby, they uncovered a duffel bag. Inside, duct tape, a flashlight, a bottle of unmarked pills. Daniel said when they told him, his skin went cold. Morris hadn't been stealing. He'd been preparing. The police called it attempted burglary, possession of a weapon. They didn't use the words that mattered most. He was planning for you. Morris's side of the duplex was boarded up within weeks. Daniel broke his lease, left half his belongings behind, and never looked back. He lives in a condo now. Key card entry, underground parking, cameras in every hallway. He checks them every night, twice, sometimes 3 times. But safety is a story you tell yourself until it sounds real. Daniel keeps the screenshot from the camera, the one where Morris crouches at the edge of the garage, half hidden, slipping inside like he belonged there. He keeps it in his desk drawer, not to scare himself, to remind himself, because horror doesn't always look like monsters. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor in a baseball cap, the man who nods politely when you pass, the man who waters his lawn at dusk, the man who waits patiently for the night you forget to lock the door. And some nights, when Daniel's condo is too quiet, when the hum of the refrigerator pauses just a second too long, he wonders, was Morris really planning that night for him? Or had he been searching for something else all along, something he still hasn't found? And if that's true, what happens when he finally does?
This 8th story comes from Melissa Grant, who was 24 the year she moved into the house she still refuses to talk about without shivering. She'd just started her 2nd year of nursing school in Spokane, Washington, young, exhausted, and for the first time in her life, living alone. The house was one of those older 4-unit places near campus. 2 upstairs, 2 below. Narrow hallways that smelled faintly of dust and something sweeter, something stale, like perfume that lingered years after it should have faded. Melissa rented the upstairs left unit. Across the hall lived a man named Ian. She only knew his name because of a package that arrived at her door one night by mistake. He never introduced himself, never smiled, never so much as nodded when they passed. Always in the same gray hoodie pulled tight, no matter the weather. Even when spring turned warm and the sidewalk shimmered with heat, he kept the hood drawn low. His presence wasn't presence at all. It was absence. Passing him in the hall felt like walking into a cold draft, as if he wasn't quite part of the same air everyone else breathed. At first, Melissa dismissed it. She had no time for paranoia. Her nights were filled with long clinical shifts, and her days were crowded with studying until dawn. But nights have a way of stripping away excuses. The first time she noticed it was around 2:30 in the morning. She had collapsed into bed, earbuds still in, when she pulled them out and realized the sound was still there. Music. But not music anyone would call normal. No lyrics, no rhythm, just drawn-out hums, warped tones that sounded like lullabies slowed down until they sagged. A droning, inhuman melody that seemed to creep in under the door, cling to her skin, and stay there long after it stopped. She sat up, heart in her throat, straining to listen. When it finally faded, she told herself it was someone's TV. Maybe Ian couldn't sleep and liked strange, ambient music. That excuse lasted until the scraping began. It didn't happen every night, but when it did, it was unmistakable. The long, deliberate drag of something heavy sliding inch by inch across a wooden floor. A dresser, a bed frame, furniture moving when no footsteps followed. Melissa pressed her ear to the wall more than once, holding her breath, waiting for the creak of footsteps. None came. Just the scrape, the pause, and silence. Then came the crying. At first, faint, soft, muffled sobs like someone pressing their face into a pillow. She froze the night she realized it wasn't in her head. Cry, pause, silence. Cry, pause, silence. The rhythm was too rehearsed, too patterned, like a metronome of grief. She wanted to believe it was human. Maybe Ian was grieving, maybe he'd lost someone. That would make it sad, not sinister. But the longer she listened, the more she realized the crying didn't sound real. It sounded performed. Then the smell came. Thick, rancid. It filled the hallway one morning so fast that Melissa gagged the second she opened her door. It was mildew mixed with something sharp, metallic. A smell that coated the back of her throat like warm pennies. She cracked every window, burned candles, sprayed air fresheners until her apartment reeked of chemical lavender. It didn't matter. The smell grew stronger, seeping into her clothes, her hair, even her skin. By then, Melissa couldn't shake the sense that Ian's apartment was never empty when it should have been. She'd stand in her doorway sometimes, staring at his, certain that if she listened long enough, she'd hear something shift inside. The silence itself vibrated, a low hum buried deep in the floorboards. Finally, she texted Dave, the landlord who lived downstairs. She kept it casual. "Hey, can you check the smell? I think it's coming from across the hall." Dave promised to come up the next afternoon. That night, Melissa didn't sleep. The crying was louder, clearer, as if it had moved into the hallway itself. She lay rigid, eyes on the seam of light under her door, convinced she saw shadows pass over it. At one point, she swore the crying crouched right outside, whispering into the crack. Her chest felt pinned. She tried not to breathe too loud. When morning finally came, she was raw with nerves. Dave arrived around 2. She nearly sobbed at the sound of his heavy footsteps on the stairs. The smell hit him instantly.
His face tightened, lips pressed into a line. He knocked hard on Ian's door. "Ian, you in there?" Nothing. He knocked harder. Silence. "I haven't seen him leave in days," Melissa whispered. Dave frowned, pulled out his key ring, tried one after another. None fit. "He must have changed the lock," he muttered. Then, under his breath, "Screw it." He rammed his shoulder against the frame. The wood cracked. The door swung open. The smell that rolled out was physical. Melissa staggered backward, sleeve pressed over her mouth. The apartment was dim, curtains drawn tight. A single lamp on the floor cast warped shadows up the walls. Clothes and food containers were strewn everywhere. A mattress sat in the center of the room, bare, stained. Someone was on it. At first, Melissa thought it was Ian, but then her eyes adjusted, and she saw her. A girl, pale, 15, maybe 16, curled on her side, wrists and ankles zip-tied to the frame, a thin blanket over her body. Her eyes were open, but empty, looking past them, hollow. Melissa froze. Dave whispered, "Oh my God, over and over. Then the girl turned her head, slow, deliberate, as if something distant had tugged her attention. Her lips parted, her voice a thin thread of sound. "Please don't shut the door." Melissa's whole body locked. Her brain screamed to run, to grab Dave, to call someone. But all she could do was fumble for her phone with shaking hands. The dispatcher's voice blurred as she stammered out words. There's a girl tied up in my neighbor's apartment." The police came fast, too fast. They swarmed the building, pulled the girl out, wrapped her in a blanket. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She didn't even look at them. She just stared, vacant, at the far wall. Melissa gave her statement with trembling hands. They told her the girl was a runaway, lured online, weeks locked away right across from Melissa's door. She couldn't process it, couldn't stop replaying every night she had heard the crying and done nothing. The smell, the dragging, the hum, the guilt ate her alive. But worse than the guilt was the question she couldn't shake. What if the girl hadn't been alone? Because when the police cut the ties and lifted her from the mattress, Melissa swore the bed shifted. Not much, just enough to ripple, as if something pressed from beneath, waiting. They never found Ian in the apartment. Days later, they located him in a storage unit across town. He sat in silence when they pulled him out. No explanation, no expression, eyes blank, as if something inside had already left. Melissa moved within a week. New locks, new neighborhood. She left most of her belongings behind. But sometimes, when the nights are too quiet, when the hum of her refrigerator pauses, when her chest tightens for no reason, she swears she hears it again. The dragging, the crying, and sometimes, faint and thin, pressed against her door. Please don't shut the door.
This last account comes from Laura Jennings, who in the autumn of 2016 thought she had finally escaped the noise and the chaos of her old life. After ending a long, bitter relationship in Boston, she wanted distance, real distance. Savannah, Georgia seemed like the answer. The slow heat, the moss that hung like curtains over the old streets, the sense of stepping back in time. She wanted quiet. She wanted to breathe again. The bungalow she rented was small but perfect. A narrow porch with chipped white paint, creaky steps that moaned under her weight, and wide windows that opened to a street where palm trees leaned crooked after years of storms. The air carried salt from the river, mixed with the perfume of wet earth after rain. Her first week there, she slept better than she had in years. It was the kind of neighborhood where time moved differently. Retirees watered their gardens in the mornings, families walked dogs at dusk. Even the traffic seemed to respect the stillness, crawling instead of rushing. Laura told herself this was what healing looked like. But there was one house she could never quite ignore. Directly across the street sat a sagging two-story painted a shade of blue that had long since faded into gray. Its blinds were always drawn, porch light always dark, the porch itself slouched toward the ground, the wood weathered and splintered. It wasn't abandoned, not exactly, but it carried the same emptiness, the same weight. Her landlady mentioned it only once, offhand. "That's Mr. Carter's place, been there forever, keeps to himself." She met him 3 days later. She was hauling groceries from the trunk when a voice drifted over the hedge. "Need a hand with that?" She startled. Across the street, Mr. Carter leaned against the railing of his porch. He looked to be in his mid-50s, tall but slouched like gravity had claimed him early. His hair was patchy, gray around the temples, and his face might have been kind, if not for the eyes. They were pale, washed out, fixed on her with a focus that made her skin prickle. "Oh, no thanks," she said quickly, hugging the paper bags to her chest. "I've got it." He smiled, but it lingered too long, like he was waiting for something more. "If you need anything," he said, "just knock. I notice things. I'm good at noticing." The words stuck with her. At first, she brushed it off. Every neighborhood had its quirks. Maybe he was just lonely, maybe odd. But as the days stretched into weeks, her eyes drifted to that sagging porch more often. She never saw lights in the windows, never heard a radio, a TV, a phone, and yet she always felt watched. The first time she heard the noise, she convinced herself it was nothing. It was late, past midnight. Laura had dozed off on the couch, the TV humming low. A shout ripped her awake. For a moment, she thought it was part of the program, but when she muted it, the sound carried on, angry, muffled, coming from across the street. Mr. Carter's voice raised, sharp. Another voice followed, lower, strained, pleading. Laura sat up, heart hammering, straining to hear. Then came the crash of something heavy, the scrape of furniture across wood, and silence. She stood at the window, trembling, and parted the blinds just enough. That's when she saw it. In the upstairs window of the blue house, a figure pressed against the glass. The outline of a body, head tilted at a wrong angle, arms slack. For a second, her brain begged her to see anything else, curtains, shadows, but her stomach already knew. The blinds snapped shut from the inside. Laura stumbled back from her own window, fumbling for her phone. Her voice shook so badly she could barely speak when the 911 operator answered. I think, my neighbor, I think something happened. Please, you have to send someone." The officers arrived quietly. No sirens, no lights. She watched them cross the street, her nails digging into her palms. Mr. Carter opened the door wearing a robe, calm, almost amused. They went in. Minutes stretched. When the officers finally emerged, their faces gave nothing away. One lingered at her door just long enough to say, "We didn't find anything, ma'am." Nothing.
Mr. Carter waved at her the next morning, smile easy, like he hadn't been caught with secrets behind his blinds. She tried to let it go. She told herself she had been overtired, seeing things in shadows. But then came the key. It was in her flower bed, half buried in the dirt, the morning after the police visit. Old, scratched, its teeth bent in strange patterns. Not hers, not anyone she recognized. She turned it over in her hand, a sick unease curling in her stomach. That night, the knocking began. Not at her door, at her wall. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, beneath her living room window. Laura sat frozen, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, pulse pounding in her ears. She forced herself to the window, yanked the blinds. Nothing. Empty street. The blue house across the way, blinds drawn tight. The knocks returned the next night, and the night after that. Always 3, always slow. Then came the morning she found one of her potted succulents knocked over on the porch. The soil scattered across the steps, roots dangling like veins. She cursed under her breath, assuming raccoons, until she bent to clean it and saw what was nestled in the dirt. The same key. Bent, scratched, waiting. Laura kept the lights on after that. She double-locked her door, pressed her ear to the silence. Some nights she swore she heard dragging sounds in her own hallway, just faint enough to dismiss, but deliberate enough to freeze her blood. She hasn't moved, not yet, but she says this. Sometimes she wakes convinced someone is standing just outside her door. Sometimes she dreams of the figure in that upstairs window, hanging limply, and wakes to find her blinds parted a fraction wider than she left them. And more than once, in the stillness before dawn, she has heard a whisper, low, from the wall itself. It says her name. And every time she hears it, she wonders, did she bring something home the night she called the police? Or has the blue house already let itself in? Because the key still sits on her counter, no matter how many times she throws it away.